Alright, what's up, what's up, everybody? Ryan Diego here, and you are watching Learn, Design, and Code, which is all about documenting the learning journey to learn, design, and code. So let's get into it. Today, what I want to focus on is we're going to be adding some utility classes to Tailwind CSS, which is a utility-first framework for CSS. So by default, Tailwind comes with a lot of great utilities for things like flexbox, columns, and width. It doesn't have a utility classes for CSS grid, and this is something that I'm still in the process of learning and really trying to kind of wrap my head around the best way to use grid. So I thought, what better way to learn than to create my own utility classes for CSS grid that I can later add to Tailwind. So let's get into it. I've just got a new pen opened up here on CodePen, and I'm going to add the Tailwind's CDN. So one thing to note here, if you're using the Tailwind's CDN or package here, is you're not getting the full power of Tailwind's or Tailwind. You are getting all the utilities that kind of come with it by default, but there's basically a whole other side of Tailwind that really lets you kind of add onto it and extend it through with plugins and adding your own custom utilities. So what we're basically going to be doing is creating our utility classes for grid here, and then the idea is that at a later date we could add those to our own kind of custom build of Tailwind. So I'm going to add a container, just again a utility class for Tailwind, and I'm also going to add my debug class. This is always very handy for when you're working with layout. I'm just going to add it to the container. And I'm going to add, we'll work with some images here just because probably the most ideal use case if you are creating if you're creating some images go really hand in hand with grids, and grid gives us a lot of power, I think, for kind of laying these out in some cool ways. So I'm just gonna first, I guess, let's start creating some of our classes here. So taking inspiration from utility classes that are already in Tailwind, there's utility classes for things like flex, and then flex columns. So sticking with that kind of naming convention here, we're just going to go with .grid to create our utility class for grid. I'm going to add the debug to that. And just for kind of simplicity's sake here, I'm going to add in a utility class h.screen, which is going to be equal to a height of 100 100 VH, which is the viewport height. And again, just so we can see this a little easier, add some color here to this particular block. So this is going to be kind of our grid container here. Let's add some images, and again, going to unsplash here. I've got a snippet to grab a random image. I already have the image tag part of it, so I can just copy that in, get rid of this comment. All right, so we've got one image in here, and let's get rid of this size part of it. All right, so now let's just copy this a few times. So we're going to get the same images here. Or not. There we go. All right. We're gonna do a kind of skateboard, snowboard, and surf themed layout here. So we've got our 3 images, and right now this display grid isn't really doing anything. You know, we've just got a single column here. So let's start actually adding in some columns here. We're gonna keep this pretty simple to start. We're just gonna do a 3-column layout. So again, sticking with this naming convention, we'll do grid dash column, and with grid you have a few options for deciding how you want to lay out, how you want to kind of place items. You can either define grid lines, or you can also just use something called you can just do span. So I guess to demonstrate this, I'm going to write these out. So this is a shorthand grid dash column. I'm just going to do span 1. And what this is going to do is, I guess we also need to add some columns here. So we can just do 1FR, 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 and this is going to give us our 3-column layout, as you can see here. And I'm using Firefox as well, because Firefox has a really great grid inspector in their DevTools. So if I go, if I go to my grid container and hover down to the class, there's this little icon here, which will actually, you can click it where it says display grid, and this is going to toggle the visibility of the grid, which is really, really helpful, because again, it can be a little tricky to understand exactly what kind of how things are laid out. So this gives you a very visual way of seeing it. So again, I could just add as many columns as I want. You can see it's going to keep adding these elements here, or adding these lines here. And there's also a shorthand for creating repeating columns. We can do repeat, brackets, I believe it's 6 and 1FR. Yeah, so we can do the number of columns that we want to repeat, and then the size. So we could do 3, 12, give us our 12-column layout, really whatever we want. So let's go to 3 here. And the FR unit is also new for grid. And what this is going to do is take up, it stands for fraction, I believe. So it's taking up basically a third in this case, because we've got 3 columns here. So it's going to expand to fill up kind of this container here. You can do fixed units. So you could do 200 pix. You can do percentages. But the benefit again of this FR unit is that it's going to take up, it's going to expand to take up kind of the available space, as much as it can kind of take up within this container here. So this should actually be its own class. Again, if we want to stick with the concept of utility classes, we could do grid 3 column, and then so now we can add this to our class here. And great, yeah, now we got this utility for adding a 3-column layout. So let's continue to add these grid column controls here. So as I was saying, you can lay these out using a span. So to illustrate this, I'm just going to make another utility class here called span2. And what that's going to do is I can add this utility class to any of these images. And what that's going to do is with our 3 columns here, if I go down to our, again, go back to our grid here, toggle that on. If I use this class of grid column span 2, what that's going to do is take this image and actually make it stretch to cover up 2 columns here. So again, rather than using something like sizes or relying on widths like 50% or whatever, I have a lot of control over where objects or elements are placed on this grid. So just to demonstrate this, I'm going to add this in here. We'll add it to our first one so it's a bit more visible what's happening. Right. Perfect. So I'm also going to set a width on this image. Unsplash is just trying to load these all. So right now you can see we've got our 2-row our image here that's taken up 2 rows, and again, to help really visualize visualize this, again, we go back to our grid inspector. And we can see this image is starting at column 1 and stretching all the way to column 3 here. And again, we can add in, let's add in our span 3. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add one more image here. What I want to do is create this, we'll do a full 3-column image here, and then we'll just have our 3 images down below. So I can go up to the top image here, just do a span 3. And that looks a little skewed because I've removed this utility class for handling how images will fit. Do cover. I'm going to refresh to pull more images here. Yeah, cool. So we've got our 3. I'm also going to take away our H screen here so that this is fitting to the height of all the elements here. So yeah, I've got this main image here, and then our three images below. And again, we can add we'll go to our second image here, or our third image, and we'll do span 2. So we've got this full size image, another image here, and our third image taking up two columns, and then our last one here just taking up a single column. So the other thing to kind of understand here is that by default, everything is basically going to, if we don't set these spans on any of these child elements of this grid container, everything is basically just going to slide kind of to the next column. So I'm going to take this out, get rid of our classes for the columns, for the spans. Yeah, Unsplash is having a hard time. Yeah, so as we can see, these images are just kind of all going to keep sliding next to one another. So very, very simple, very easy way to just get your quick kind of three column layout. We could do, again, repeat 4, and we've got our 4 column layout here. As you can see, there is some based on how these images are coming in, because I'm just randomly grabbing images from Unsplash and not defining any sizes. They're not kind of stretching to fill the full container, so that's something that we need to figure out or address. But for now, let's actually just keep adding these. Let's continue to add these utility classes for creating our template columns. So again, we can just do 2, and then we're going to get our 2 images. This nice square kind of grid here of our 4 images. And again, we could go, we can do the old 12 column grid layout. The other cool thing too, so obviously right now these are kind of, this looks a little tight. Let's actually, I was going to take away our debug class here to get rid of the thread outline, but let's keep it. We can also easily add in spacing between all these elements using grid gap. And this works for both the horizontally and vertically. So similar to padding or something like margin, if you just set one value, so 10 pixels, that's going to apply it both between rows and then between columns. But we can, again, specify these separately. So I could do 40. So in this first case here, this is defining the grid gap between rows, and then the second value is doing it between the columns. So if we just do 4. was wondering why I was only getting these 2 columns here and I didn't hit 4. So yeah, grid gap's a great way to add some spacing between these elements. So again, that could really be its own own utility class. I'm not sure kind of the best way to name or handle the spacing between those. So right now, there's one other class that we'll add here. One other kind of trick. Right now, let's say we had something like the 12 column, your 12 column grid. If I, we'll go back to our inspector, turn that on. So it doesn't make a crazy amount of sense to have, I guess you could have spans for, span 4, span 5, all these different values. There's a really, I believe this should work. There is a way that you can use span where if you use a negative value, it's going to span the whole row. Let's see if this works. All right, I have to look this up. Make sure we got everything typed in correctly. So it looks like it's not span. So for now we can't, I gotta revisit this, but for now what you can do, if you want to do a full span across really any number of columns, so right now, again, we've got 12. The shorthand for grid column here, the way this works is that you can set your first value. This basically stands for, the grid column shorthand starts for the starting column. So here we're defining that the starting column is going to be 1, and then you do backslash, span, or yeah, slash the ending value. So what -1 actually does is it makes it go to the very last column, no matter how many there are. So we could say a 4 column, and it's still going to keep taking up the full amount here. We could do 2 column, and yeah, so that's pretty handy. That no matter what, kind of a column you have, no matter how many columns you have set up, this grid column 1 slash a -1 is always going to take up a full width. And again, just to demonstrate what can happen if we actually set a value. If we go to, let's say, grid 1 column /7, because we've got our 12 columns, I'm just going to go again to the inspector here. Again, this is where it's really handy to have this tool in Firefox, you can see it's going from 1 and ending at 7 here. But again, to demonstrate, if we do -1, this is going to take us all the way to the end of these columns here. So that's a couple utility classes that we could look at adding to something like Tailwind. Grid's got a lot of power, and yeah, it's really a matter of figuring out, you know, what kind of makes the most sense and what gives us, you know, this, what gives us kind of the most flexibility with all these, you know, individual utility classes here. So again, this has been Learn, Design, and Code, working with Tailwind and creating utility classes. Thanks for tuning in. Have a great day.